Hey, good morning. We are on Mem Aleph Amud Beis 41b. We're discussing the story around the Hakel while Agrippas was king. Agrippas, a king from the Herodian line, that is from Herod, which is an offshoot of the Hasmonean line, the Hashmonaim, meaning to say not from the line of King David. That's the point. And this particular man, Agrippas, was of questionable lineage. And Mishnah relates that while he was reciting the Torah reading for Hakel, right? Hakel, the big gathering of all the Jewish people that come once in 7 years, like this year, they gather in the temple to hear the king read from sections of the Torah. And one of the sections the king is to read is the section where the Torah describes the mitzvah to appoint a king. So the Gemara already told us yesterday that although the protocol is that he sits while he's reading the Torah, right? And we established yesterday the reason is because he's not in the actual courtyard, he's not in the Azara, he's in the women's courtyard, which is the outermost, the easternmost courtyard of the temple, which is, as I mentioned yesterday, probably the closest thing to a social hall in the temple. That's where all the big events would happen. So he's allowed to sit there, even though he's not from the lineage of David. He can still sit there, right? Because the law is only kings of the lineage of David can sit in the actual Azara, in the actual courtyard. But in the women's courtyard, which is farther east, anyone can sit, or at least certainly a king can. And the protocol is that he would sit. The king would sit while he read from the Torah at the Hakel event on this great stage that they would build. The Gemara, the Mishnah told us that when Agrippas read from the Torah, he stood, and the sages praised him. And yesterday we discussed, they praised him, even though the law is that a king is not allowed to forgo the honor due to him as king. It's not his, it's the office, it's not his personal honor. Nonetheless, in this case, the honor of his seating, or the honor of his seating is the honor of the mitzvah, not his own personal one, and he stood out of respect for the mitzvah, therefore it's okay that he stood. And that's why the sages praised him. That's what we established yesterday. Yeah? Okay. Now the Gemara tells us another part of the event of Agrippa, of the Hakel in the time of Agrippas. So the Gemara quotes the Mishnah which says, it's about halfway middle of the page. You have it there?
Yeah.
Yeah. So the Mishnah there said that when the king Agrippas got to the point in the reading where, as I mentioned, he reads the section of the Torah that describes the mitzvah of appointing a king. And there the verse says, you should not place upon you as a king a foreign man. And he therefore started to cry because his lineage was questionable. And the Mishnah tells us that that the sages calmed him down by saying, Agrippas, don't worry, achino ata, you are a brother, because at the end of the day, his mother was Jewish, and therefore he was a legit king, or is allowed to be a king. So even though he was crying, the sages consoled him. Now, the Gemara does not directly comment on the statement of the sages, but the Gemara does nonetheless imply that this flattery of telling Agrippas you're a king was questionable, to put it that way. Yeah, and it shouldn't have been done, as we'll see presently. Okay, so the Gemara says, Tana, we learned in the Mishnaic text, Mishmei Rabbi Nassan, in the name of Rabbi Nassan. But I say Shah, at that juncture, when people flattered, or I'm not sure if the Gemara means literally at that. Sorry? Which word?
Flattered.
Yeah. But Yisha at that time, when they flattered Agrippas by telling him you're our brother, or maybe it means in general, the Jews were placating him. The haters of Israel were liable for consumption, meaning for complete eradication. Now, this phrasing, the haters of Israel, is a euphemism. It actually means the Jewish people. This is often the Gemara. When the Gemara speaks negatively of Jewish people, Gemara won't say directly the Jewish people are deserving of X. The Gemara will say the haters of Israel are deserving of X, and that's a euphemism. So it's polite language. You don't put into writing something so negative about the fellow Jews. So Nassim is commenting and saying that because of the Shechniful Agrippas, because they flattered Agrippas, even though he was a king of questionable repute, they flattered him, so they were deserving of consumption. So Rabbi Nassim is what's the word? Is critical of the sages and in general the Jewish people for criticizing Agrippas.
Criticizing?
For flattering Agrippas. Now, I have to comment that the Mishnah does not make any mention of this, obviously. The Mishnah just says that they praised him, or that they said, you're a brother, without commenting on the negativity of it. Now, the Mishnah is not a book of history. It's not. It's a book of law. Now, if the Mishnah quotes a story that happened, presumably there's halachic ramification. As in most cases when the Mishnah quotes a story. So if the Mishnah is telling us that the sages calmed him down by saying, you're our brother, because his mother was Jewish, so it would seem that the Mishnah is, if not favorable, doesn't, at least saying certainly it's acceptable to do so. Because the Mishnah doesn't bring any counter-argument. The Gemara is here bringing from Rabbi Nassim that he was critical. But the Mishnah doesn't bring any counter-argument that says, sages praised him and said, you're our brother. But others came along and said, they shouldn't have done that. The Mishnah doesn't say that. The Mishnah just tells the story as a fact that they said, you're our brother. Right? So the Mishnah seems to at least validate their flattery of Agrippas. It doesn't say it was a great idea, but certainly I think it's not critical of it. Follow what I'm saying?
Yeah, but I'm not sure why the word flattery is used here.
Because he shouldn't have been king because he came from slaves. He came from slaves. So he shouldn't have been king anyway.
No.
But because his mother was Jewish, they said, yeah, you're a brother. It was inappropriate, as Rashi says. It was inappropriate that he become king because he came from slaves. So Rabbi Nassim is critical of their flattery, where the Mishnah just states as a fact. So presumably, I'm going to go back for a second to the Mishnah to see, but presumably, the Mishnah is okay with that behavior, and I'm going to suggest perhaps why, and it's relevant to our modern times. What's going on in Russia? So, let's see the Mishnah.
It does say in the Mishnah.
The sages praised him, and that's it.
He had tears flowing after.
Right, and then the Mishnah says that they calmed him, they consoled him, they
fear not.
They flattered him.
Brother.
Yeah, because your mother was Jewish, so don't worry about it. Yeah, so, and Rabbi Nassim is being critical of that behavior, saying they all deserved consumption, they deserved complete eradication because of their flattery of Agrippas. But the Mishnah doesn't seem to be too critical of it at all.
Not at all. Just
states exactly.
Back.
Exactly. So, and I'm suggesting the Mishnah states a story without any counter claim. Presumably, the story is legit.
Well, it's open to interpretation. Is that
open interpretation?
The Mishnah is there.
Yes, open to interpretation to explain why the Mishnah came to its conclusion, not to come to an opposite one. Right? Now, the Mishnah doesn't continue in comment and say, well, there was others who were critical.
There's always competing.
Right. So, and when there's competing opinions, when there's competing opinions, and the Mishnah only quotes one, it's because the Mishnah is siding with one.
I think there's any opinion in the Mishnah.
Sure, it's a statement of fact. Right. So again, the Mishnah is not a story of history; it's a history book.
No, for sure.
It's a book of halacha. So if it's
Rabbi
quoting a
has
story, if it's quoting a story and telling us something the sages did,
Right.
it's telling us what they did was correct. In fact, the Gemara just before, in fact, the Gemara in yesterday's Gemara, when the sages praised the Agrippas for sitting and reading, the Gemara defends that position. The Gemara challenges by saying, isn't it against halacha to sit? Or isn't it against halacha for a king to forgo his honor? The Gemara validates it. Because when the Mishnah tells us a behavior of the sages, it's a halachic statement. So likewise here, the Mishnah tells us an opinion, a behavior of the sages. If they console him by saying, you're a brother, that's a halachic statement. The Gemara is quoting Rabbi Nassim, which disagrees. Okay, so Rabbi Nassim disagrees, right? But nonetheless, the Mishnah still has this other opinion. And I'm suggesting the reason is because throughout, and this is something that's relevant to, as I mentioned, to today, with the Jews in Russia. Throughout history, especially when it came to non-Jewish kings, here to Jewish kings, maybe it's a bit different here, but especially when it came to non-Jewish kings, our sages and our rabbis spent a lot of time and effort flattering, praising, and bribing the kings for a very simple reason: keep the Jews in their country alive. It's that simple. Today, in our Western privileged society, thank God we're Western and we're privileged, the notion of what speaking truth to power, disagreeing with authority, is a staple of our culture. You're supposed to do that. That's a good thing, right? And the government protects you should you be critical of the government. That's a privilege of very few countries in a very short period of time. Last couple hundred years, even not the last couple hundred years. Treason existed in the United States of America as well, right?
Seems to be eroding though. Then.
I'm not making a comment on that, but yeah. the notion that you're allowed to speak truth to power, that the government protects you, is a modern notion, and thank God it exists. But for most of history, for most countries in the world, it's just not the case. You speak truth to power and you're in jail or worse, right? So we in the West like to judge history and judge people by saying, how come they didn't speak up? How come the Jews are going along with this terrible king who's doing terrible things? It's a very simple thing. Their choice was go along and protect your people, go against and have your people slaughtered. Choose. Yeah. And the choice is very clear. Life overrides all of it. And Jewish well-being overrides this. So flattery, the Gemara even mentions stories. The Gemara talks about stories of sages who went to Rome to bribe the Tsar. There was a community of Jews living in Rome whose job it was to lobby for the Jewish people while Rome was controlling Israel. And the same thing is throughout all of history. A big part of the community leadership was to lobby to the local authority, to the kings, the noblemen, bribe, flattery, whatever was necessary. Right? And Jews would have in their service, they would have prayer for the king. Whether they liked what the king did or not, they still did a prayer for the king, because if they didn't, it would be a serious problem. Yeah. Right? Chassidim would say that when the Tsar was overthrown, they lost the mashal in Chassidus. Chassidus, Torah in general, but Chassidus in particular wants to describe proper fear of heaven. They'll use the example of the fear in front of a king. When the Tsar was overthrown, we lost that. We don't know what fear in front of a king is. We have respect if we were to see the President of the United States, or if we were to see the Prime Minister of Canada, we'd have respect. But fear of doing something he doesn't like. She doesn't like what I do, so what? That's something that didn't exist most of history. Fear in front of a king was a real thing.
Right? Yeah, I mean, you could have his head chopped off.
Exactly right.
Emotion.
Yeah. Doesn't tell a story. It's a good story to have. It's a nice story. The Tsar once came through a town. And of course, the entire town came out to see the Tsar. And the Tsar noticed one particular fellow, a Jew, who didn't have any great fear or reverence on his face. And the Tsar didn't like that. Tsar comes down, everybody's got to be, everybody's first of all, everybody's to stand there and watch with complete full fear and awe in the face that you're standing in front of the Tsar. And this particular fellow didn't have that on his face. So the Tsar sent a messenger to the town, says, I want to see that fellow. Go find that fellow. So, of course, first of all, the Tsar messages come to town. There's commotion in town. The Tsar's message is coming. What does the Tsar want? Oh my gosh, he wants this particular Jew. The guy starts trembling. Oh no, what does the Tsar want? It could be, who knows what. The Tsar is calling it a little simple guy in the middle of a small village. He's freaking out. And of course, he travels with the guards, the Tsar's palace. And as he's going through the palace, his fear, he's getting anxious and more fearful and more anxious about what does the king want from me? What does the Tsar want from me? So finally, he gets into the Tsar's room and he's sitting there, standing there, shaking. And the Tsar said, "That's what I wanted from you. You can go home." Just wanted him to know, just to have that fear. That's it. Now, all to say that the notion of flattering the local authorities, especially when they're despotic, is not something. It's something in the West that we look down on. Are they flattering a despotic ruler? But in history, a despotic ruler is exactly the kind of person you do flatter. Because otherwise, you're gone, along with all your people. And perhaps this is why the Mishnah doesn't comment on the negativity of the sages flattering Agrippas, because who knows what they got in exchange for that flattery? Right? The Gemara tells a story earlier about someone who said something negative about Agrippas, and he started killing people. And the sages countered and said, no, it's okay. And they protect it. And as a result, they protected Torah. Right? I'm missing the details of the story, but we had the story way back. So maybe that's perhaps why the Mishnah is not outright critical of sages for flattering Agrippas. And perhaps Rabbi Nosson is critical because Agrippas at the end of the day is a Jewish king, as opposed to a non-Jewish king.
Yeah,
Right? So it could be things are different. Is it a foreign king that's ruling over you, or is it one of your own that's ruling over you? And when is flattery appropriate and not appropriate? So it's a subtle question. It's not an easy question. And perhaps that's why there's a divergence here between the Mishnah just stating as a fact, implying that this is a proper behavior versus Rabbi Nosson who's critical.
Maybe it's for a king who's crying, it's sort of like a demeaning place.
Right. So maybe in that place they should have been.
So they wanted to placate him in a sense to minimize the embarrassment of his own embarrassment of having tears before the public.
So maybe they should have left. Maybe they should have left him to his being. I don't know.
I don't know.
It's very difficult. Oh, well, I forgot the reason why it's relevant to Russia today. People are very critical of Chabad in Russia for being appeasing to the authoritarian Russian government. If you think for half a minute, you realize that if he's not appeasing to the Russian government, they're all bounced out of the country and worse.
Yeah.
So his being nice to the Russian government is keeping thousands of Jews alive. So let's just not jump to judgment from our privileged Western position where we're encouraged to speak truth to power. For most people in the world, for most of history, you don't get that privilege. Anyway, sorry, I interrupted you.
No, I'm just thinking that perhaps because he was crying, to afford him some sense of dignity. And you're okay.
But you're saying it's not flattery because it's just a dignity.
It's not appropriate for a king to show weakness in front of his constituents.
Maybe that's what it is. Yeah, maybe the reason why they
as the sages were the second in line for authority, it was their responsibility to
right. At the same time, they could have said something like I don't know. They could have said something to the effect of like, Agrippas, it's inappropriate for a man of your stature to be crying in public.
That would be like the remaining king.
Okay, maybe. Yeah, that's a good point.
Which would be disrespectful.
So maybe the flattery here was an agenda, and the agenda was to put the king in a position of power. Yeah, maybe. Interesting.
When the king shows weakness, like any leader, the whole fabric of the community could fall apart.
Right. That could be. Yeah.
They can still fear why is the king crying? People start to lose it.
Yeah.
It's not showing position of power and strength.
Yeah.
For the greater good of the community rather than
Yeah, I hear you. I hear you.
the king's own.
Yeah. Yeah. I hear you. I hear you. Okay, the Gemara goes on to say, that the ramifications of the sage's flattery of Agrippas had societal ramifications as well, creating a culture of flattery. Maybe that's why I was saying Rabbi Nassim is more critical because Agrippa is a Jewish king, and with the flattery of a Jewish, in other words, when the Jews are flattery of a non-Jewish overlord, no one in the Jewish community thinks that this is the proper way to behave. They understand that this is because we need to keep things going.
Right.
But it could be because he's a Jewish king, it had ramifications societally, which is what the Gemara is about to comment on. So maybe that's where the criticism comes in, perhaps. Anyway, again, I'm suggesting all this.
Yeah.
Okay, so the Gemara says like this. Rabbi Shimon ben Chalafta. Rabbi Shimon ben Chalafta said, "Yom shegover Agrippa shel Chanufa." It's a play on word. Agrippa means like his nickname for Agrippas, but Agrippa means the power. And the day the power of flattery took over. Now that Agrippas is king, and the sages are running around, and the sages are being flattering of him, so that became the culture. Flattery. You flatter bad people, and get what you need. So in this, yeah, that's right. So the Gemara makes 3 comments. Number 1, I'm looking at Rashi as well. Nisavsu hadinin, judgments and ruling became corrupted. Yeah, it became corrupted. Judgment became corrupted because judges would flatter the litigants. Right? Flattery became a means of getting what you need. So the judge needs something from the litigant who's going to be flattering of him too. So it became this loop of corruption. Number 1, niskalkalu hamaisin, behavior deteriorated because religious leaders who would see people behaving negatively wouldn't say anything because flattery is the way to go. So criticism fell apart. And number 3, no one can honestly say my behavior is better than yours. And the way Rashi puts it is because behavior deteriorated. So it's a cycle. The way Rashi seems to be saying it's these 3 different things follow one to the other. Judgments and rulings became corrupted because judges are flattering litigants.
Well, litigants are flattering judges.
The way Rashi says it is the other way around. Rashi says Dayanim, Shechnifa Dayanim is Balei Adin. Sorry? Why? Because the litigants are wealthy people. I don't know. And the way to get, right? So the judges who are in position of leader are flattering to get what they need. And then religious leaders aren't reprimanding the misbehavior. And if they're not reprimanding misbehavior deteriorates, it gets worse and worse. So no one could say mine is greater than yours because, well, everybody's just messing up. That's what Rashi puts.
Everybody's turning a blind eye.
That's right. That's right. That's right. That's how Rashi seems to say it on a simple reading of Rashi. And I think perhaps a bit.
Everyone flatters one another, and people no longer know the truth.
That's what I was going to say. So Rashi doesn't say that. Rashi doesn't say it directly, but it seems that the undercurrent of all these 3 things is that flattery leads to a society of dishonesty. We have quite a few times where the sages comment on their own piety. Quite a few times the sages say, I have this virtue over that person. This person has this virtue over me. Even talking about humility. The Gemara says that when Rabbi died, there was no more humility. And one of the sages come along and say, well, I'm here, so there's still humility. Right? So to us, we're like, what kind of humility is that? Because we live in a world that's to begin with dishonest.
Humility.
Sorry?
Self-proclaimed humility.
Yeah. Okay, well, to explain that, I think we learned in Sotah, in Sanhedrin, I think we explained it then, we learned it at the time. But what I'm saying is that there's a lack of honesty. And when when there's a lack of honesty, and to begin with, people can't talk about, in other words, if there's an honesty about faults, one's own faults, and one's own virtues, and someone else's fault and someone else's virtues, right? Then a person can talk about his gains and a person can talk about his losses, meaning in terms of virtue, and talk about it honestly without any bias and speak about it without any just a matter of factly, almost honestly.
And filters.
Any filters. And then can hear from someone else his own criticism of himself too. And he can share criticism with someone else. Because there's a certain honesty that exists in it as a society. But once the honesty of society is deteriorated, everything is in question. Are you saying this because you want to get something out of me? You're like, you hear a compliment, someone gives you a compliment, and you're like, what does he want from me? Why is he complimenting me? There's a motive, right? So that
ulterior motive.
That's lost once flattery becomes the means of getting what you need done. And maybe this is what undergirds Rabbi Noson's criticism, is that it creates, that's right. Even though Rabbi Nosson doesn't say so, so Rishim ben Chalafta is saying this, but the Gemara puts the two statements one after the other. First, Rabbi Nosson's statement that the Jews were deserving of consumption, of complete eradication. And then Rishim ben Pazi says, well, here's what happened. So perhaps that's what happened, because it wasn't like they were flattering some king out there. They were flattering one of their own. So it became the milieu, became the culture.
Someone's saying, be careful when you do this. It could lead to...
It creates a society of dishonesty. Hmm. And in some way, maybe, that's why Hasidim brought back the notion of Farbrengen.
I was just thinking about Farbrengen.
A big part of the Farbrengen is
an honest
honesty.
Dialogue
to have an honest
brothers.
It's an honest conversation where sometimes you can say a critical word, you can hear a critical word or praise, and you hope it's an honest and a good praise. And if the praise is honest and good, then the criticism is also honest and good, and people aren't so offended because they understand it's in the context, or hopefully it's in the context of truth. It's a context of truth and the context of love. Not that I want to get something off my chest, I'm going to point out your flaws. But if we're coming from a place of love, I truly want to hear my own flaws so I can grow, and share your flaws so you can grow. And I can praise you too for the same price. Because that'll encourage your growth as well. Right? So the flattery is not just the dishonesty in what's negative in others, but it's also in the dishonesty of what's good in others, or good in yourself.
It's almost like group therapy.
Farbrengen. It is in many ways. It's a group therapy. It's a group growth.
It's a group the way it's meant to.
It's a group growth. As long as there are these two foundations, love and honesty. If the foundation is love and honesty, then it's very, very healthy. But if the foundation is dishonesty, then love cannot be with dishonesty. Because dishonesty at the end of the day is ulterior motive. I'm praising for this. Then it's not love anymore. It's self-motivated. Right? Dishonesty and love must go together. It's not dishonest, it's not loving. And if it's not loving, it's not dishonest. It's not honest. Right? It doesn't, if it's not honest, it's not loving. If it's not loving, it's not honest. It has to be both. And that's perhaps the Gemara's Rishim Bechalafta's comment in saying that when once flattery begin, judgment is no longer, you can say your judgment is corrupted. It's not just judgment between like an actual court, but your judgment of others.
Oh, yeah.
Like someone's judging me. If there's an honesty, he's not judging me, he's just assessing the situation. But once there's a dishonesty, now the judgment of one person to the next becomes corrupted. Right?
Yeah, the judgment becomes corrupted.
That's right. And then when it says here that behavior is corrupted, so Rashi said behavior is corrupted because nobody's getting their actions corrected because it's all flattery. But another thing could be is if flattery is the way to go, then I'm going to behave publicly in such a way that gets me flattery. So even my good behaviors become corrupted. Not just that there's a corruption of behavior that I start behaving bad because no one's correcting my ways, as Rashi points out. But it could be even my good behaviors become corrupted because now I'm doing it for flattery. Because the whole society has become dishonest. So even my good behavior is dishonest.
Even the good behavior is not truthful behavior.
Exactly.
It's for me.
That's right. That's my suggestion. Perhaps also what this means here. And that's what the Gemara says. No one could say mine's greater than yours. Because the whole thing is dishonest.
Oh,
the whole thing is dishonest. Right? So Niskalkula Maisim, behavior is corrupted. Rashi says that people start behaving bad because everything's flattery, so no one's correcting anybody. No one's reprimanding anybody. But perhaps the corrupted behavior is, even the good behavior is corrupted, because now the whole thing has become just one big dishonest society. And if no one can honestly say who's greater than who, because it's all for show. It's all for flattery. So a good Farbrengen built on honesty and love is certainly the remedy for all
So
of this.
according to Rabbi Nathan, what should have been done when the king was crying here?
They could have just said, they didn't have to say anything.
They have to say,
They didn't have to say anything. They could have just sat quietly. But it seems that we're not speaking more broadly, not just about this.
no, for
It
sure.
could be it's this
I
case,
was
I mean,
just
specifically,
thinking,
but it could be more broadly. I see this little dalet here. Look at the dalet on the side. Yeah, just because it's source they after. Yeah. It could be just more broadly the way they were treating the people. It's not necessarily this particular moment, but it could be means this moment because it's a shot at that moment. It could be means at that era. Anyway, now from
there's a lot
here,
of
sorry,
corruption. There's a history of corruption with the priesthood
and well, the priesthood, the sages were not
Sure.
necessarily part of the priesthood. The priesthood was dominated by the Tzaddukim, not the sages. By the Sadducees, not the sages.
okay.
So the sages were not the same necessarily group of the priests, which is an interesting thing that I noted when we looked at Gemara, when we looked at Mishnah, is that even though there's all these kinds of corruption, the king is corrupt, the priesthood is corrupt, came to the Hakel, the sages are there too. Being at the temple, which they usually avoided because of the corruption.
Oh, really?
They were
Yeah.
called the Perushim, separatists, to use a modern term, because they separated themselves from political life, because they didn't believe in any of the political factions, whether to appease the Romans, whether to fight the Romans. They were against all of it. They separated themselves to preserve Torah, seeing the destruction that was coming.
Is that in Park Avo?
That's right. So even though they avoided that realm, they still came back for the mitzvah of Hakel. Because Jews come together for the Hakel no matter what. Which is an interesting point.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Maybe also because it was in the women's courtyard, it wasn't so much tied to the halakhic.
No, it's part of the temple. It's got to be in the temple.
Oh, yeah.
The pasuk says you have to come to the place that God chooses.
No, for sure. Right.
Yeah. Anyway, so we'll stop over here, and on Monday, the Gemara is going to get to times when maybe flattery is appropriate. So that's why I to begin with put this framing. It's two sides of the coin here. It's not as if like flattery is never appropriate. Sometimes it's needed for survival.
Well, definitely with non-Jewish.
Definitely with non-Jewish kings.
Leaders, yeah.
Yes, but on Monday we're going to see the Gemara is going to go back and forth. Sometimes saying when it's fine to, even though it's not good, but it's okay at certain times to flatter. The Gemara is going to say that. In other statements, the Gemara is going to say flattery is the worst thing ever, it destroys everything. So we're going to be going back and forth on exactly when, how, and in what manner flattery is appropriate. And perhaps as we go through these things, we'll see the nuances the Gemara is trying to convey. Okay, have a wonderful day and a good Erev Shabbos.